I thought the best way for me to start would be to make a very brief overview of the 4 previous Conspire conferences. They're listed on the back of your program. So this is the 5th of 7. We came up with 7 major themes that sort of undergirded what we were teaching here. And this is the 5th one. We hope to have 2 more, God willing. But if you care to follow along, the first one, which we did 4 years ago, is it 5 years ago? Our basic methodology. And I'm just going to repeat it slightly, but so you can see how what we're doing this weekend builds on all of that. And our methodology is a unique one, although I don't think it should be. It's somewhat a surprise to Wesleyans or Methodists because they're used to a quadrilateral. And I'll tell you why I shortened it to a trilateral. And we call it our tricycle in the Living School, that we move forward by 3 criteria which regulate and inform and balance one another. And the front wheel is the one that most of us were never given permission or education to trust, but we do anyway, and that's experience. Neither the Catholic, Orthodox, nor the Protestant tradition really gave their people permission and skills to know how to trust their own experience. And the irony is, you did anyway. What else can you do? Of course, you're going to read Scripture, you're going to read tradition through your own experience. And that was our blind spot, that we didn't see that. So the back 2 wheels of the tricycle are tradition. And when I say tradition, I don't mean small t, I mean big T, 2,000 years of Christianity, the intertestamental period, the Hebrew Scriptures, and the history of the other world religions. God hasn't just been talking to Christians, right? God is talking to everything God has created since the beginning of time. And we're just lucky enough to live in a time where finally the human mind can think that way. We pretty much, not pretty much, almost entirely till the 1960s, we grew up inside of tribes, what David Brooks now calls teams. And it doesn't really matter what your team believes or what your tribe really stands for, you're loyal to your tribe. That only began to break apart at a broad level in the 1960s. And you are, I hope, the beneficiaries of that. So our methodology by which we teach everything is moving forward on the tricycle of Scripture, tradition, and experience, with experience leading. Second year, foundation. And here's where I got into my initial Trinity teaching, although I hadn't written the book yet at that point. And I think it was meant to be, the authentic Christian understanding of God is not a being, and Michael quoted it as Paul does in Acts 17, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. That's very different. And it shows how little effect the Trinitarian doctrine had on most of Christianity. I quote in the book, The Divine Dance, Karl Rahner, who says we could drop the doctrine of the Trinity tomorrow, and 98% of Christians, nothing would change whatsoever. That tells you our very foundation is askew, is off. If we don't have the shape of God correctly named, everything built on top of it, it doesn't work. And I think that's the huge conflict every one of us is experiencing if you're raised in any Christian denomination, that it just doesn't explain so much of reality. And so our theology is profoundly Trinitarian. But I want to repeat here the very thing that, well, not repeat, I guess say here for the first time, that most people would think when you speak of God as Trinity, oh God, this is going to be a super Christian trip laid on us. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. A true understanding of Trinity opens you to authentic, sincere, intellectually sincere dialogue with all of the world religions. And we sort of overplayed the Jesus card, pulled Jesus out of the Trinity, and found ourselves in competition with the other world religions. In short, just to summarize what a Trinitarian theology is saying is, frankly, God is more a verb than a noun. More a verb than a noun, and I'm standing on absolute Christian orthodoxy in saying that. Check it out with your bishops, all right? This is not heretical. It's just that no one ever told us that. We thought you ordinary lay people weren't ready for the big guns, I guess, you know. And we ended up with, not that pagans are bad people, but basically a pagan definition of God. But I said at the big April conference here on the Trinity, it's no accident that the Latin word Deus is a direct transliteration of the Greek Zeus. And we didn't move much beyond Zeus. He was a male sitting on a throne, upset most of the time. And this just cannot work. It's not even close to the divine revelation that we were given. So we speak in our daily meditations this year of building from the bottom up. And so Trinity is first, then we got to reposition Christ. And that gives us a different frame, which was the conference 2 years ago. For those who see deeply, there is only one reality. There is no distinction acceptable between sacred and profane. It is all sacred, right? And of course, that demands a correct understanding of the Christ, who existed from the moment of the Big Bang, and Christ is simply our placeholder name for this coherence, this amalgam of matter and spirit, that God decided to show God's self, and that is everything your eyes have ever seen since the moment of your birth. The entire visible universe is the manifestation of God. And the hard part of that, of course, is how do we include suffering and death and tragedy and evil in that? And that's why that part of the mystery, at least in Christian parlance, had to become visible, the tragic event that we visualize in the cross. So if God can say yes to it, it was supposed to give us somehow some strange ability to say yes to what normally the rational mind cannot say yes to. Then just last year, we had our conference on ecumenism, and we used as that phrase that was my better-known book in earlier years, everything belongs. No one needs to be scapegoated or excluded. Now, that might feel to many of you like it doesn't deserve its own theme. But when we see that not just the Christian religion, but each in their own way, I would say all of the world religions, and because they reflected the tribal level of consciousness in which they were born, but are largely known at this period of history as defined by exclusion. We know what we're not. We know who we're against. We know who does not belong. But almost to the degree you know that, you don't know the opposite. You don't know what you really stand for, who you really are. And God, by any fitting description, has to include everything. What else would God be? I call him in several of my books the great allower. And some days when I see the evening news or what's happening to this country, I just say, I don't think I could allow that much if I were God. I would have stopped it a long time ago. Who is this God who allows? But again, if God is a verb more than a noun, maybe in the process itself, as Michael mentioned, there is something that generates the movement forward. And I'm going to be talking about that. Cynthia, who teaches in our school, teaches about it even better. So everything belongs, no exceptions. No one needs to be scapegoated or excluded. And of course, those of you who've heard my work on, and other people's work, not mine, on the meaning of the Christ, it's that he became the scapegoat because to reveal the sin of the world. The sin of the world is thinking other people are your problem. And you have to change them, punish them, eliminate them, exclude them, or where did we get that? Well, I think It's the way most cultures define themselves, by quid pro quo meritocracies of punishment of the unworthy, and we just transferred all of that to the world of religion, which was made to order to transcend all of that. But we just weren't ready to see it. We define justice as retributive justice, and I would, without knowing you personally, I would bet it's true of every one of us in this room. Not the real prophetic biblical tradition, which is restorative justice. And until our very notion of justice matures, we're probably going to keep falling back on quid pro quo meritocracies of God loves the worthy and punishes the unworthy. The overcoming of that is what we call non-dual thinking. And you first have to overcome it in the very way your mind functions. Or you'll keep doing it. I see no reason to believe. And it'll take its liberal form and its conservative form. And the liberal one is even more disguised. Just know that. So don't think that people, because they're progressive, are not dualistic thinkers. Most of them are, until they've experienced what we would call absolute transcendence, or God. So that leads us to this year, transformation. You see it written here behind me. The separate self is the major problem. Now, most of us, that wasn't even of itself made very clear for us. Even though if you grew up Christian, you had passages like John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. Cut off from the vine, you can do nothing. You might as well throw yourself into the fire. You're going to be useless. That's a pretty strong statement about separate identity. Or in John 12, unless the single grain of wheat die, it remains just a single grain. But you and I are the product of a good 5 centuries of necessary, don't hear me putting it down, but it still was a pendulum swing in one direction, of intense individualism, intense individuation, where everything was about defining yourself as the vine cut off from the branch. And it's served many good purposes. A lot of us in this room have a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of what's good about our ethnicity and our country and our religion. But now it's starting to show its bad fruits. Right? The pendulum has swung so far in the direction of the private individual that many, and this is liberals as much as conservatives, are deeply scandalized if you offend their private self. They can be word police just as much as the conservatives can be. And we're the kind of crowd that needs to hear that, see? So the separate self is the major problem. Now, I'm sure Reverend Angel and Mirabai are going to come at this in a more kind way than I tend to do it. But we still want to state it right at the beginning in a forthright way. It's not the shadow self. Now, we've really got to emphasize that, because what I call first half of life religion in the book Falling Upward, that's the way almost all religions start. Someone said in a book I read years ago, which I can't even remember, that all religion begins by the making of a fatal distinction between the pure and the impure, either in food or places or people or body parts or sexualities. And you'd think at that early stage of consciousness, probably spiral dynamics would call it the purple or the red levels. At those levels, you decide that the way you can be worthy of God or acceptable to the holy is to separate yourself from the unholy. It's sort of an understandable mindset. And so we create purity codes, debt codes, don't touch this, don't eat that. And the loser is almost always the human body. I haven't found a religion yet that doesn't have its own form of it. That for some reason this encasement, this embodiment that we see getting older and balder and dying, it looks like the inferior function, you know? It looks like the unworthy self. And so most religions identified spirit with the air and up there, and bad with embodiment and down here. Without an experience of true incarnation, our Christian word for that is the Christ, one who holds both of them together at the same time, we don't get it. If we can't put it together someplace out there, we find it very hard to put together in here. And we continue to create various purity codes. And again, I want to say liberals do it each in their own way, because the unconverted self will always do that. It will try to make itself not just separate, but superior in its separateness. And even your political correctness can be your superiority. We got to watch it. The farther you move on the journey, the more subtly the shadow and the ego both disguise themselves. At my age, it's around every bend, just hidden. Again, and if I don't have some honest, loving people in my life to hold up a mirror and help me to see it, I can't see it. So let's say right now, you've got to know that the shadow isn't something that is inherently evil. It isn't. It's simply that which is inherently hidden. And it invests itself entirely in being hidden. That's its job, is that you don't see it. Now, we heard all this earlier mystical language, which Mirabai writes about so well in our Catholic mystics, of darkness. And we jumped to the conclusion that darkness meant evil. It just means what you can't see, where you can't see. Now, I admit, when you can't see your own illusions, what makes a delusion is that it's delusional. And why you can't see it is because you're delusional, all right? So you need a wife, or you need a husband, or you need a friend, or you need somebody to hold up the mirror and say, you're delusional. And you need a stronger mirror the older you get, because it gets more and more clever. Your lack of holiness hides behind all kind of games, and the most dangerous game of all, the best place for the devil, if I can use the medieval language, right, to hide is, you got it, religion. Religion. The most successful hiding place for evil possible is hide behind God language and church services and Bible quotes and priesthood and all these things that are supposed to be so sanctimonious and wonderful, and usually are meant to preserve the sacred profane distinction. It's over, as we learned last year. So we're I had a lovely brunch this morning with Mirabai and Reverend Angel, and we realized we all like this language of Ken. We're going to have to put Ken in here, which isn't very hard to do. I quote him an awful lot. But he tends to come up with very simple Anglo-Saxon clear language, which makes it very hard to avoid. And one of his helpful phraseologies in the world we're going to be discussing this weekend is he speaks of cleaning up, growing up, and waking up. Brilliant, just brilliant. Because we haven't had those clarified. Most of our churches were almost entirely preoccupied, and most religions at the immature levels, with cleaning up. Getting rid of what makes you look inferior, bad, nasty. Burn your Playboys, boys, and then you've woken up. Really, that's not true. The best that is what the 12-steppers call recovery. Recovery, in the Catholic language, we said there were 3 major stages to the spiritual journey. The purgative way, recovery. The illuminative way, the whole middle journey of gradually growing up, which we'll talk about. And growing up, more than anything else, I'm going to make this as strong as I can, has to do with shadow work on every level of your life. As you gradually see the impurity of your motives, the self-centeredness of your entire worldview. Now, if you're not willing to suffer those humiliations, that you're basically selfish. The only groups I know who can say that are 12-steppers. You can't say that in sophisticated Catholic or Episcopal churches. No, we're not selfish. We're very enlightened people. No, we're all selfish, right? We all think it's all about us, And that major death is what's necessary, that overcoming of that radical sense of separate selfhood is what John of the Cross would call the dark night. Very few people are willing to undergo it. We just want to keep enlightening this little Richard self and advertising this little Richard self. And isn't Richard wonderful? And isn't Richard smart? And Richard's written books. And God. And the more of that kind of stuff you have, the more dangerous you are because you believe it. And if you don't have someone holding up the mirror, you take it too seriously. So the main obstacle to growing up is the shadow self. Shadow work never stops, right? And the shadow is simply what you do not want to see. And again, the politics of this country in the last 18 months has shown us that we've got an entire country that does not want to see very much. It wants to see only what it wants to see. And so it creates its own reality. And we live now in a post-truth society. And that's true across the board. That we create our own reality and we bow down before it. That's narcissism's lowest point. I don't know how you create a great civilization when you have people at that level of immense spiritual immaturity. And many of them, here's the rub again, are people who go to church on Sunday. So it's going to end up as a massive critique of organized religion. That we can have this many churches, this many universities, this many people who use Jesus talk and read this New Testament and can come to the conclusions that they came to. It defies rational analysis. Oh, by the way, since I brought in that word rational, to settle you Wesleyans and you Methodists who wonder why I didn't say reason. See, John Wesley had 4 criteria. He had a little 4-wheeled bicycle or tricycle. And I shortened it to 3. And the reason I did that is because I think his 4th pedestal, reason, wins out all the time in the Western world anyway. And I'm not going to give it the credibility of a wheel because you're too overly rational already. I know you don't think you are, especially if you're college educated, but you are, all right? You've been trained in the left brain and you think it's the only brain. As Ian McGilchrist says, the emissary has become the master. In all of history, the intuitive brain was the master and the rational brain was the emissary. We turned them around. And that's the product that's had many good effects in Western civilization. It allowed you to fly here yesterday or drive here. So we're not going to put down rational engineering, mechanical, reasonable thinking. But when it comes to the spiritual world, it's the least helpful. Let me just leave it at that. It's the least helpful. It keeps trapping you all along the way. So the main obstacle to growing up is the shadow self. The main obstacle to waking up is the separate self. So I would say very few. The Buddhists by far come the closest. But even they, as Reverend Angel is easily willing to admit, can get in all the traps that we get into too. But they still have explicated and described the overcoming of the separate self better than any religion. Where we find it in the other world religions is only in the mystics, which is why Mirabai just keeps translating them. Because these are the people who move to the non-dual level, and the great dualism, of course, that has to be overcome is that you are separate from God. That's the biggest dualism. When Jesus can say in John 10, I and the Father are one, he is the ultimate for the West, non-dual master. But few of us, unless you were in one of the few monasteries that still taught true contemplation by the 20th century, very few did, according to Thomas Merton, In fact, he said almost none. We had all lost it. Unless you were exposed to that, you tried to understand the teaching of Jesus, which is all from the yellow turquoise, non-dual, mystical, contemplative levels, with a dualistic mind that was largely, forgive me for giving the spiral dynamics colors, but it might intrigue you, from the blue level. The blue level is where almost the entire of America was in the 1950s. Tribal, 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 tribal. Tribalism was truth. Religion was not about transformation, and this leads us directly into our theme. It wasn't about transformation, it was about belonging to the right group. Got it? Belonging systems. Not belonging to God's humanity, the people of God, as we called it at Vatican II, but being loyal. So I would say my early years in the seminary, which were before Vatican II, without any doubt, and Franciscans should have known better, but the primary virtue I was taught was not love, it was obedience. Obedience was what it was all about. Because when you're at the tribal level, it's all about loyalty and obedience to the protocols of your group. And if you don't follow them, you're shunned or shamed or excluded. It doesn't have to do with love at all. In fact, to be perfectly honest, I have to say it tends to create people who are very unloving. I can get away with saying that because I'm a priest. I guess I can get away with it. No. Tends to create people who are very unloving. While living, talk about denial of the shadow, living with the image that because they go to the Lutheran church, or any other church, of course, they're very loving because they love Jesus. Well, that got us into orthopraxy instead of orthodoxy. Now, we still use the word alternative orthodoxy, but orthodoxy up to now has largely referred to what you believe verbally, mentally. It had little to do with what we now call orthopraxy. How do you, in fact, live your life? And Ken Wilber calls this the performative contradiction. Comes up with these great phrases. Performative contradiction at the heart of most liberals and the heart of most Christians. That they say they believe in a whole bunch of things that they really would never act on. You know, would we really want to live in a black neighborhood? Oh, come on. Do we really want our daughter to come home and say she's lesbian? Come on, please. No. We're really not transformed at any deep level, is what I'm saying. And until all of our belief systems, love your enemy, is pretty clear from Jesus. But then the reason we had to begin with redefining God is the whole thing was undone by we had a God who didn't love his enemies. It's called hell. Were any of you raised with belief in that? Huh? We have a God who undoes the whole transformative mystery, who in fact doesn't just exclude his enemies, but tortures them, and not just tortures them for a few minutes, for all eternity. This is an unworkable religion. It will never transform people, never. My best-selling tape a couple years ago, it's because the staff pushed it, but was Hell No. Rob Bell couldn't even get away with that, you know. Evangelicals were fierce against saying that, but Catholics, we have a little more wiggle room to talk in such a way. Why? And this is part of our belief in the big T tradition, is because we know the fathers of the church, and we know about the first 500 years, and we know the church didn't always believe this stuff, huh? And that what you were given to believe has much more with Dante's Inferno, 13th century, 12th, than it does the teaching of the biblical tradition. But that's why we're in such a wonderful position to talk this way, because we can draw upon sources that are primary sources, that are biblical and traditional sources, to keep those back wheels greased. And that's the only way I've survived all these years. The wonderful Franciscans exposed me to the whole tradition and taught me the sources that I could rely upon, so I knew I was not a heretic, or I was not unorthodox. So, what I'm trying to say, probably saying it as I too often do in a circular way, it's something that you can't come to without the journey itself. It's not a belief system. See, believing things doesn't demand a journey. It really doesn't. I mean, I was given my Catholic conclusions in the first grade. It was a little terrible document called the Baltimore Catechism, written by a Monsignor with a minor education from New Jersey. Now, nothing against New Jersey, but and it was, laid on generations of Catholic kids as if this was straight from God. So it was, belief systems. But it gave, and I realized this, and even this election helped us to realize this, people can't stand too much ambiguity or anxiety. When they're living in the middle of ambiguity or anxiety, anyone who comes along and says, I have the truth, will buy into it. 60% of people will buy into it, just to take away their anxiety. And this can be documented throughout human history. We would sooner have a tyrant than have anxiety. We would sooner have someone to tell us what to do than to live in what we called faith, which is a combination of knowing and not knowing. But about 300 years ago, we moved into a several hundred-year period in the West that we strangely call the Enlightenment. It's exactly the opposite of enlightenment, but where we idealized rational thinking. And you know what happened? Very understandably, we who were Christians in Europe at that time just felt really stupid. We felt outside the conversation. All these intellectual people at the great universities of Europe were smart scientists, and we were just dumb blue-level believers. And so, you know what we did by the middle of the 19th century? If you were Catholic, we decided to declare that the Pope was infallible. We got along 1,900 years without an infallible Pope. It did just fine, I think, But there was an immense anxiety by the middle of the 19th century. But you Protestants are not off the hook. All right, you know what you did? You declared the Bible to be inerrant. Nobody in the first 5 centuries said that. I mean, Augustine had 4 to 8 levels of interpretation of every scriptural text. We went backwards, not forwards in so many ways. But that's what happens when you get anxious. You want to settle the dust. Give me someone who's going to give me certitude. And I hope I'm not giving you certitude. One author, wonderful former evangelical, I should say, sent me a book called The Sin of Certitude. I said, well put. It was already in the book of Genesis. If you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will most surely die. Well, we've been eating it for centuries. Just bushel baskets of, to be sure we're right. That's why I like that Bird Talker song so much. So it's not belief systems. It's not belonging systems. Finally getting to the point of this conference. But I have another chance to be with you. So what we're saying is it's about transformation. And if your religion is not transforming you, it's junk religion. And I mean transforming you at the neuron level, not just the beliefs. Belief doesn't change your neurons. It doesn't. That's why we emphasize in the Living School and all of our conferences, practice. Practice, is basically something that rewires this. So your knee-jerk, dualistic reaction, which you probably had largely in place by the age of 6, your fear of people with colored skin, your fear of people of a different religion, your fear of people with a different sexual orientation. And they just stay in place unless you have an experience of the absolute. And what an experience of the absolute does, it relativizes everything. Everything. That's how I can tell if you've had an experience of the absolute. You don't want, and you're comfortable living with a certain degree of ambiguity. You have enough absoluteness that you can deal with relativity. But I'm not saying I'm denying absolute truth at all. In fact, I probably believe in it more than most people. But our capacity, or my capacity, to understand it, to write about it, to verbalize it, that's very limited. But I'm not going to deny, if any of you are fearing, the existence of absolute truth. Our name for that is God. But we know we have as many understandings of God as we do people in this room. So we can't just say, because you believe in God, you believe in the absolute. When I see you relativizing your own ego, then I'll know you've met the absolute. But when you're still your primary reference point for everything, I can be pretty sure you have not met the absolute. When you can never let go of offenses, when you can never overlook a few moments of discomfort because you're not in charge, or whatever it might be, those are the giveaways. The things that bother you reveal your shadow, all right? And the people who bother you are your shadow. So you need people who really tick you off. You really do. And you say, why is that ticking me off so much? Because dang it, she's just like me. But it's the part of me I hate, and it's a part of me I don't want to admit to, and it's a part of me I don't want to change. So you know what the trade-off is? I'll hate it in her. It's much easier than changing it in yourself. Hate it in her. This is no small point. And Jesus says it very clearly in the Sermon on the Mount. You know about the log in someone else's eye and the speck in someone else's eye and the log in your own. Jesus was a magnificent psychologist. He really was. And then he warned us against this false shadow work of wanting to appear superior. Remember that story? It always bothered me, where he said, you sweep out your house, make it tidy and clean, and then you leave, and 7 devils, even worse, come and enter the house. And the last state of the house is worse than the first. He's saying, don't spend too much time trying to make your little house tidy and clean, because you're not tidy and clean. Got it? All right? Get over it. All right? What did he say instead? Matthew 13, the field that the angels are going to harvest at the end of time, he said, is a field of both weeds and wheat. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. Check it out. I didn't make that up. Matthew 13, all right. Let both the weeds and the wheat grow together. That's what Carl Jung called an increasing capacity for paradox, for ambiguity, for contradictions. And our St. Bonaventure says that the very cross itself is a geometric image to communicate that all of life is operating at cross purposes. And when you try to reconcile, holy reconciliation, Cynthia calls it, holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling. Whenever you try to reconcile the opposites, what the Republicans might be saying that's true, what the Democrats might be saying that's true, you will be crucified from both sides. Does that need any proof? No one likes reconcilers. We don't want to live with ambiguity. We don't want to live with mystery. We don't want to live with shadow. In total light, if this room were bright as the sun, you and I could not see. If this room were absolute pitch dark, you and I could not see. The only way the human eye works is in the presence of shadows. This room is filled with a mixture of darkness and light. That's correct seeing. The metaphors are all there, so simple, in so many ways. I found a wonderful quote from, I took out this is from your book, Mirabai. I think it's the second dwelling. Oh, darn, I had it all marked. I'll still find it. It's in the second dwelling where Teresa talks about nothing being, not her first statement about the soul being the most magnificent, but her second statement. Well, I'll try the first one, since I just came to it. This is in the very beginning of her magnificent interior castle. And the reason I want to draw this together on the notion of the soul is because all of you have one, all right? And it's a place that is very spacious, very real. It's so big, it's the great allower. It can hold the idiosyncrasies, the contradictions that you are and that everybody else is. On the very first page of the first dwelling, the soul of a good person is none other than a garden in which the beloved takes great delight. What do you think a place might be like that? So that a king so wise and powerful, so pure and filled with all good things, would find so delightful. I myself can come up with nothing as magnificent as the beauty and the amplitude of a human soul. Now, most of us were never told that this whole mystery, its processing station, is already planted inside of you. We were taught our soul was something we saved to go to heaven later. Oh, don't go with No, it's something to be awakened now. And it's already there. And as she says, maybe I can still find that second quote where she says it even better. See, now you see my one compulsiveness at work. I just want to find the quote. She says, once you learn how to live in this place, it's broad, it's deep, it's rich, it's incomparable. Now, Augustine had already talked about the soul with similar language in the 4th century, but there will be no autobiography written like Augustine's Confessions for another 1,000 years. Because what happens after that is religion, under the barbarian invasions and empire and all the rest, Western religion became almost entirely externalized. There was not much teaching about the soul, about awakening the soul, about the capacities of the soul to forgive, to understand, to let go, to love. And that external religion is the religion that so many of us are rightly, I think, reacting against today. It doesn't get you anywhere new. It really doesn't. It's the face you show toward it is the face it will show toward you. You can write that down. You don't have to, but if you want to. We were trained in mistrust of the soul, judgment of the soul. And that's the face then it turned back toward you. Endless judgment of you, why you're not holy enough, why you're not good enough, why she is your enemy, why you should fear that. The face you turn toward the soul is the face that will turn toward you. Once you learn to trust it and allow it. Many of you know for many years I would do Lent in a hermitage, and it would always become richer the longer I was there, because you found your grounding place. And it was infinitely fertile, infinitely creative, infinitely fruitful. But it wasn't about rigid doctrines or what group do I belong to. As some of you know, I was just away for 40 days to write the book on the Christ. I just couldn't believe how easily it came once I was able to return to that space. But I knew it wasn't, and please don't make this sound airy-fairy, because I don't intend it that way, and it isn't that way. I knew it was being done unto me Your spiritual life becomes much more an allowing than a doing, right? A letting go rather than a performing, a surrendering more than an achieving. Now that's hard for Americans to learn, particularly if you're a 3 or a 7 or a 1 or an 8 on the Enneagram. We're all, charging into life, doing it with our very, strange energy, whatever it might be, and not realizing there are a whole bunch of things we're not seeing, and we're not allowing, and we're not enjoying, and we're not appreciating. The soul can appreciate and use everything. That's why the soul is like God, because that's what God does. God is not just the great allower, but the great forgiver. That God apparently has no trouble forgiving. And Jesus' words from the cross sort of sum it up. Father, forgive them, as he looks out from this crucified position. They don't know what they're doing. And this comes very close to, I think, mainline Buddhist teaching. And I'm going to use a hard word, forgive my irreverence, but most people aren't sinners. Most people are just stupid. No one ever taught them wisdom to know these things, So that's what Jesus is saying. You don't know what you're doing. He didn't use the unkind word stupid, but he said, humanity doesn't know what it's doing, so I don't have time to hate them. Most people are unaware. They're ignorant of who they are, of their own soul. They have no knowledge of their own soul. Little. If you were raised in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, you were told not to trust your inner world. You were to trust hierarchical figures, popes and bishops and priests. Now we find out most of them don't know much more than we knew either. So we can't keep doing that. Now some do, but not all. That doesn't mean we hate them. That doesn't mean we throw them out. But we've got to find some other sources for wisdom. And what I hope we're doing at the CAC and here in the Living School is sending you back to your own soul. Not in an individualistic way. And I want to spend a few moments on this before I let you go. In fact, what will tell me that you've really discovered your soul is you'll recognize it's not a independent ownership. That to move into the collective unconscious, if you want to use that word for it, it's one possible good word. You, in fact, are connected to everybody else. You're more Richard than ever before, but you're less Richard than ever before. You're everybody else. You're at the deeper stream where it's all one. There's that beautiful bird talker. We should play it again at the end. Do you think we could? Could you play it again at the end? Get ready if you can, yeah? After I stop talking. So I know it can sound, when I'm sending you back to your own soul, like I'm giving you permission to all be individualists again. Nothing could be further from the truth, please. If you really go there, I'm not sending you on a narcissistic head trip. But in fact, the deeper stream where all things are one, where you're more yourself and less yourself at the same time, where it's not all about you. And that's why, like when I write the recent book, it's me writing it, but it's not me writing it. I'm dipping into a deeper stream where I'm not steering the ship. Now that's where you have to learn to live. That's what it means when the branch is connected to the vine. The test, whether you are, is frankly how loving you are. If you disrespect other people, even in your mind, if you dismiss and minimize other people and races and religions, even in your mind, you're not connected to the vine. It's that simple. People in love are in the force field that we would call the Holy Spirit. People who remain in love remain inside that field, and they are usable for God. But if you entertain hateful, negative, fearful, oppositional thoughts, even in your mind, at that moment at least, you're separating yourself from the vine. That's why the great spiritual teachers invariably will emphasize love. Love is the way of remaining connected. So, I think that's all I want to say. Can we show the bird talker again? Is that possible? Thank you. And then after that's done, Ben's going to come back up. Yeah. Thank you.
I've played the teacher, the preacher, guru, maintaining posture, separating me and you, as if the thoughts of God were mine and mine to speak. I've listened with an agenda so I could prove all of the shit I believe to be true, just to hide the fear of being weak. Burn the scorecards, balance out the scales. We are one when distracted by our different sails. Underneath what's detectable with eyes, every particle's vibrating with the same light. On your tongue, shut your brain up long enough to hear the lowly hum. Underneath what's detectable with eyes, every particle's vibrating with the one light.
Finally agree.